On the afternoon of July 8, 1993, a horrifying crime was discovered in the upscale residential area of Taman Duta, Kuala Lumpur. Amid the oppressive heat of the southwest monsoon season, a worker was diligently pushing his lawnmower through thick bushes. The roar of the engine echoed in the sweltering heat, what seemed like an ordinary workday. But suddenly, a jarring sound shattered the peace. The mower's blade abruptly jammed as if it had hit something solid. The worker bent down and pulled back the thick grass to investigate, and then a horrifying sight appeared before his eyes. Among the green grass lay a woman's arm, pale skin, fingernails still painted a light red. The image left him frozen, a chill running down his spine, and he nearly staggered as he ran toward the nearby road in a state of panic to call the police. Police arrived at the scene immediately after receiving the report. In moments, the Taman Duta residential area suddenly became the focal point of a large-scale investigation. During the sweltering afternoon, police patiently turned over every bush, examined every corner and drain, careful with every inch of ground. Within less than 2 hours, gruesome discoveries began to emerge. From deep within the bushes, at the bottom of drains, and even in piles of damp garbage nearby, black plastic bags were pulled out, one after another. Each time a bag was opened, the crowd held its breath, leaving only the choked sound of horror. Inside, dismembered human body parts were clearly visible. This was no ordinary crime scene. It was a meticulously arranged savagery. These body parts had been washed clean in an eerily thorough manner, with no traces of blood, the cuts sharp, neat, and uniform, as if created by a cold and skillfully practiced hand. Right then, everyone understood. This was not an impulsive murder committed in a fit of rage, but a cruel act that had been carefully planned, step by step, detail by detail, chillingly methodical. However, despite finding numerous plastic bags containing dismembered remains, police still couldn't piece together a complete picture of the truth. Because among all those pieces of tissue, the most crucial part was missing, the head. Without a face, they couldn't establish identity. The death of this woman remained, for the time being, a nameless mystery. The forensic pathologist conducted a meticulous examination. Based on the remaining skin and body tissue, he concluded the victim was a young woman, approximately 20 years old. Then, small details gradually emerged. Neatly trimmed nails painted in bright colors, and even the pubic area had been cleanly trimmed. These traces indicated this young woman was someone who paid great attention to her appearance and loved beauty. But who was she? Why did she have to suffer such a tragic fate? 3 days later, on July 11th, police decided to expand the search area around where the body was discovered. Under the scorching sun, search teams began their meticulous and arduous work again, advancing step by step through wild grass and rocks, leaving no corner unchecked. When they ventured deeper into the bushy area, 2 black plastic bags were discovered, carefully hidden in thick grass and damp soil. The moment the bags were opened, the atmosphere seemed to freeze. No one could speak. Only suffocating silence remained. Inside was the woman's head, the only crucial part that had been missing all this time. But unfortunately, after many days exposed to intense sun and weather conditions, it had severely decomposed, swollen, and deformed beyond facial recognition. Police were still at a dead end, because even though they had found nearly the entire body, they still couldn't determine who she was. By this point, police had collected a total of 7 plastic bags, containing a body divided into 11 parts. They tried to piece it together, reconstructing the body's shape, hoping to find some clue about the identity or cause of death. However, even as the pieces gradually fit together, the complete picture of the case remained shrouded in mysterious fog. On the contrary, the deeper they investigated, the more sinister and inexplicable the case became. Traces on the body showed the perpetrator acted with extreme calm and skill, yet left no clear leads. It's important to remember that in the early 1990s, Malaysia didn't yet have advanced DNA testing technology like today, and domestic forensic equipment was very limited. All identification methods at that time relied on manual observation and experienced judgment. No traces, no witnesses, no verified identity. The investigation quickly reached a dead end. To establish the victim's identity, in this desperate situation, police decided to do something unprecedented: publicly release images and identifying characteristics of the deceased in a press conference, hoping to mobilize community strength. Soon after, shocking photos of the victim's skull occupied the front pages of major newspapers. The gruesome images shocked many people. Some readers felt nauseous on the spot. Some even had nightmares for many nights. However, this bold and controversial decision ultimately brought an important breakthrough. Besides releasing images, police also included a list of unique identifying features such as filled teeth and carefully manicured nails. They went further by enlisting the help of Amiruddin, a street artist who regularly painted in the Central Arts area. Based on skull photos from the forensic pathologist, Amiruddin personally went to the morgue to observe the victim's facial structure, and from there drew portraits of the victim when she was alive. These sketches were published in newspapers and quickly created a wave of circulation in the community. A few days after the sketches were widely published, a ray of hope finally appeared. A shop owner living in the Bandar Baru Bangi area proactively contacted police. He said that a woman renting a room at his place had been missing for many days without any news, and notably, the portrait sketch published in the newspaper bore suspicious similarities to her face. Upon receiving this important information, police forces immediately moved to the address provided by the informant. There, they found the family of the young woman suspected to be the victim of this case. On July 20th, under police escort, a woman who introduced herself as the victim's second older sister, Mrs. Chor Cindy, went to the morgue at Kuala Lumpur General Hospital to perform the most painful task: identifying the body. Stepping into that cold space, she was overwhelmed by the heavy smell of disinfectant permeating everywhere. The body lay motionless under a white cloth. Chor Cindy thought she had mentally prepared herself enough for this moment, had tried to reassure herself throughout the journey there. But when the white cloth was slowly lifted, revealing what remained underneath, all mental preparation became meaningless. She immediately lost all strength. Her legs couldn't stand steady. Her whole body collapsed onto the freezing floor. Uncontrollable waves of nausea surged in her throat, sobbing mixed with ultimate pain. The deceased's face had long since decomposed heavily, facial features faded and deformed beyond recognition. Chor Cindy tried to search for any familiar signs, but everything seemed to have been erased by time and death. Until her eyes inadvertently swept down to the lower body and saw the pubic hair that had been neatly trimmed in a very distinctive way. That moment made her collapse. This was a detail that only extremely close people could know. She quickly covered her mouth, tears flowing uncontrollably, heart-wrenching sobs echoing in the cold room. Because she knew too well there could be no mistake, this was her sister who had been missing for days. However, to ensure the identification was completely accurate with no errors, police immediately proceeded to take a blood sample from Chor Cindy. This blood sample was then carefully packaged and sent to Singapore, where there was more modern equipment to perform comparative DNA testing. A few days later, amid the family's anxious waiting, the final results were sent back. They had a direct blood relationship. The DNA match rate was undeniable. The identity of the body was finally confirmed. The woman who had been brutally murdered and dismembered was Chua Chor Tho. On the afternoon of July 21st, police convened a press conference to make an official announcement to society. The identity of the deceased in this sensational dismemberment case had been traced. It was the famous singing and dancing star at the tea house in Bandar Baru Bangi, Kuala Lumpur at that time, Chua Chor Tho, nicknamed Yidian Hong. Chua Chor Tho was only 30 years old that year, but in the vibrant nightlife wave of Kuala Lumpur, she was no longer just an ordinary dancer. She was a star, a phenomenon, a name spoken with admiration and curiosity. At the Nine Dragon Karaoke and nightclub located in the Bandar Baru Bangi area, every evening when there was an announcement that Chor Tho would perform, the space inside was always packed to the point where there wasn't an empty seat. When the stage lights slowly shone down, illuminating her dazzling costume, the atmosphere in the entire room seemed to freeze. And the moment she raised her voice in the first note, Every eye in the hall seemed hypnotized by an invisible force. Chor's voice was graceful, carrying a strange allure that few could match. Therefore, people gave her an impressive nickname, Yidian Hong, implying that she was like the brightest red flame in the dark night, prominent, captivating, and impossible to overshadow. This name quickly spread throughout the upper-class nightlife circles of Kuala Lumpur. Customers wanting to specifically request her service were continuous, sometimes having to book many days in advance. There were even quite a few people from other cities, from more distant areas, willing to travel long distances to Kuala Lumpur just to witness her mesmerizing presence with their own eyes. However, behind the glittering spotlight on stage was a life story full of bitterness that ordinary outsiders could hardly imagine. Chor was born and raised in the town of Kota Bharu in Kelantan State. She was the youngest child in a poor family of 5 children. Life back home was never easy, and the future ahead was bleak with no way out. Therefore, when she was only in her teens, with all the innocence and courage of youth, Chor held vague dreams of a brighter future and decided to go to Kuala Lumpur alone to seek opportunities to change her life. But the reality waiting for her was far harsher than what she had dreamed. Having just set foot in the bustling city, Chor, a young woman without qualifications, without education, without family support, and no connections to rely on. With no other choice, she had to accept the lowest jobs, scraping by at the bottom of society. She once tried working as a multi-level marketing salesperson, knocking on doors in unfamiliar residential areas, arms clutching old materials, forcing a strained smile. The response she usually got was just cold headshakes, suspicious looks, or sometimes outright dismissals and insults to her face. There were days she traveled across half the city, feet worn out but still couldn't sell a single product, stomach growling with hunger, pockets empty. Later, she also worked as a laborer in garment factories on the city outskirts. This work was extremely exhausting and tedious, day after day repeating the exact same mechanical movements. To meet delivery deadlines imposed by the factory owner, she frequently had to stay up all night, working non-stop until 2 or 3 in the morning under cold neon lights. Her eyes became increasingly tired, red from lack of sleep, hands pricked by needles countless times. Sometimes blood would stain the pristine white fabric, forcing her to quickly bandage hastily and continue working. The hardships of life kept pressing heavily on the small shoulders of a young woman. In a hasty decision perhaps born from a desire to find peace and stability, she agreed to marry a man named Ho Seng Kun. He lived in the city of Seremban, the capital of Negeri Sembilan State in Malaysia, a place not far from Kuala Lumpur. She bore him 2 sons, becoming a mother while still very young. However, life after marriage didn't bring the happiness she had dreamed of. Her husband had a violent temperament, often angry over trivial matters. The small house frequently echoed with harsh arguments, curses, sometimes even physical violence. The couple kept struggling, continuously conflicting. Finally, after several years of exhausting struggle, in 1991, they officially divorced. After that traumatic divorce, life's burden once again fell on her shoulders, this time much heavier. She became a single mother responsible for raising 2 small children. She tried her best, doing whatever work she could find, from street vending to working odd jobs in small eateries. But it wasn't enough to cover living expenses. Finally, she was forced to make the decision to entrust her 2 beloved children to a government social welfare department nursery. She was heartbroken, but she also knew she had no other choice. This was the only way for her children to live better, even if it meant she had to be separated from them. Returning to Kuala Lumpur alone, Chor knew she needed to find a new path, and she found the stage, not as a passion, but as the only escape, a final opportunity to change her life. Initially, she was just an unnamed backup singer at the 9 Dragon Karaoke bar. No one really noticed. She learned constantly, practiced diligently every day, observed famous people to understand what audiences really wanted. Gradually, managers began to recognize her special voice, recognized how she conveyed deep emotions through each song. They gave her better opportunities, more prominent positions on stage, and finally the center stage, under the brightest spotlights. Below the stage, applause erupted throughout the space, continuing endlessly. The name Chor Tho, or Yidian Hong, began to spread by word of mouth, mentioned with admiration. From an unknown girl no one knew, she gradually, through her own effort and talent, became the hottest star of her time in Bandar Baru Bangui, becoming a symbol of Kuala Lumpur's upper-class nightlife. But each time the curtain fell, Chor Tho returned to her small room, slowly removing the heavy makeup covering her face. No more sparkling lights, no more vibrant music, only quiet silence remained and facing herself alone in the empty space. In her heart at that moment, only deep sighs remained, full of helplessness and loneliness as she thought about her two sons. Nevertheless, she never gave up hope for a better future. She often confided to those around her, to close colleagues, that her greatest dream was to open her own karaoke bar. Then she would no longer have to depend on anyone, would decide everything according to her own wishes. And finally, when she turned 30, the greatest dream she had cherished was gradually becoming reality. After years of non-stop work, saving every penny with astonishing diligence and determination, she and her sister Chor Cindy, along with some close and trustworthy friends, cooperated to pool capital to open a karaoke bar called Pak Lok in the Bukit Jalil area of Puchong Township. From a hired singer, Chor Tho had now officially become a bar owner, a business owner with her own decision-making power and responsibilities. This transition, in many people's eyes, might just be an ordinary career change, but for her, it wasn't simply a change in social status or income source, but a profoundly meaningful turning point. For the first time in her 30 years of life, she felt she truly had control over her own destiny, no longer having to depend on others' wishes or goodwill. With increasingly stable income from running the karaoke bar, with a more solid social position, Chor Tho began to dare dream of a bigger, much more meaningful plan. That was the plan to bring her two beloved sons back to live with her. She wanted to rebuild a complete, warm, and happy family home, a family truly belonging to her. She wanted her children to understand that their mother never abandoned them as they might think, but only had to be temporarily separated, endure the pain of separation to have enough time, enough money, and enough ability to create a better, more worthy life for them. This was the greatest motivation, the most powerful flame driving her to continue striving tirelessly every day. However, life once again proved that it's always full of cruel and unpredictable surprises. Just when everything seemed to be heading in the right direction, fate once again, and also for the most cruel time, played an unforgivable trick on her. A trick that would end all the dreams, hopes, and plans she had laboriously built over the past 30 years. According to the emotional and painful account of her sister Chor Cindy, on that fateful day of July 6th, a day that seemed ordinary like any other, when she opened the mailbox at the front door as her daily habit to check, she unexpectedly discovered a small piece of paper carefully folded. Opening it, she immediately recognized the familiar handwriting of her sister Chor Tho. The content on the paper was very brief, just a few lines. She would go on a trip to Penang with a friend named Mr. Lee for a few days to rest, then would return immediately, don't worry. At first upon reading, Chor Cindy felt somewhat strange because leaving a handwritten note like this wasn't at all like the normal communication method Chor Tho usually used. Her sister was someone who lived very modernly, always had her phone with her and usually called directly or stopped by to talk face-to-face when there was something important to announce, especially matters related to traveling far. Just leaving such a brief note was truly unlike her sister's style. Moreover, she had never heard Chor Tho mention this friend named Lee before, but then she reassured herself, thinking perhaps her sister had to leave suddenly, or left early in the morning when she was still sleeping, so didn't want to disturb her and just hastily wrote a note. She also thought Penang wasn't far, just a few hours' drive, and a short trip like this was normal, nothing to worry about. At that time, she didn't think too much about those small abnormalities, nor had any specific reason to suspect something was wrong. But the days that followed passed, 1 day, 2 days, then a week. Chor Tho seemed to completely disappear from life. No phone calls came back, no messages, no signs of life. Chor Cindy began to worry, calling her sister's acquaintances, but no one knew where she was. The prolonged silence made her increasingly restless, afraid. The feeling of unease kept rising. But she also couldn't imagine that at that time, her sister was no longer in this world. She had been killed in a savage and cruel way beyond imagination. After verifying the identity of the deceased, the investigation moved to the critical phase, finding the perpetrator and motive. Investigators analyzed that such cruel dismemberment tactics couldn't be a random act. This type of crime mostly stems from extreme personal grudges or complicated emotional relationships. Only intense emotions like hatred, jealousy, or fear of exposure would lead to such brutal behavior. Therefore, police focused on screening those in Chor Tho's closest circle of relationships. The first person investigated was her ex-husband Ho Sang-kun. Their relationship after the 1991 divorce was extremely tense. According to testimony from relatives and neighbors, he had many times spoken badly of his ex-wife with angry words. He had uttered statements like, "Someone like her with that profession should be unwanted by anyone. If she dares bring the children to my house, I'll show her." These threats, while perhaps just words spoken in anger in the context of a murder, became extremely suspicious. However, after thorough investigation, police discovered that on July 6th, the exact day the crime occurred, Ho Sang-kun was still in his hometown of Seremban. Many reliable witnesses clearly confirmed his whereabouts throughout that day. This alibi evidence was solid, making it nearly impossible for him to have been present in Kuala Lumpur at that time. Despite having potential motive, the alibi was too clear. Police quickly eliminated suspicion and redirected the investigation to other subjects. Just when the investigation was at a dead end, Sister Chor Cindy decided to surrender her sister's personal diary to police. This wasn't an easy decision, as it certainly contained many private secrets. But to find justice for her sister, she had to do it. When flipping through the diary pages, investigators made an important discovery. It turned out Chor Tho had a secret romantic relationship with a married man. In emotional handwriting, she recorded their meetings, promises, as well as the pain of loving someone she couldn't publicly acknowledge. The man's name was Yim Wei Sheng. Police also found his phone number carefully noted in the diary. But surprisingly, before police could proactively find him, right after the press conference announcing the victim's identity, Yim Wei Sheng appeared at the police station himself to provide information. Yim Wei Sheng was 33 years old that year, had a rather striking appearance and left a special impression. He wore thin-framed glasses, had a thin but tall build, his entire body exuded an intellectual air. His appearance gave people the first impression of someone refined, polite, educated. Regarding his background, he was born and raised in a very devout Christian family. In his younger years, his family sent him to Singapore to study theology at a prestigious academy. After completing his training program and returning to Malaysia, he had worked as a missionary for a short time, sharing faith with the community. When he entered the police station that day, Yim Wei Sheng wore a pristine white shirt, pressed dress pants, everything neat and tidy. His demeanor was unusually calm, showing no signs of worry or panic like many people when entering a police station. His responses were natural, coherent. His voice always kept at a polite and restrained level, even somewhat gentle. Every gesture, every word seemed calculated, carefully controlled. Having barely sat down before investigators could ask questions, he proactively took from his shirt pocket a carefully folded piece of paper and handed it to police. He explained this was the note Chor Tho had left for him before she went missing. On the paper, written in handwriting, "Mr. Lee and I are going to Penang. We'll return after 10 days. Based on this piece of paper, Yim Wei Sheng began to present his own analysis and judgment with a confident tone. He suggested that Chor Tho's disappearance and what happened afterward were very likely closely related to this mysterious man named Lee. He implied that the important lead lay in finding Mr. Lee, not with him. Police found his cooperative attitude, on one hand making detailed records, noting the time of interaction, origin of the paper, and preservation process. On the other hand, simultaneously deploying verification, starting to trace the identity, whereabouts, and whether objective evidence existed of Mr. Lee. Regarding his relationship with the deceased, his testimony appeared clear and logically ordered. According to his account, the two met through music. At that time, Chor wanted to improve her singing skills, so she registered for vocal lessons with him. As for him, he was originally someone who specialized in teaching piano, regularly offering private training classes. The teaching process and professional exchange caused them to interact frequently, gradually developing a closer bond. Over time, their initial teacher-student relationship gradually turned into romantic feelings. However, he later testified that due to differences in personality and life perspectives, they couldn't continue. They decided to end the romantic relationship, returning to the status of normal friends. Overall, throughout this initial meeting, Yim Wei-sheng's presentation was very reasonable, coherent, and clear. He used cautious language, carefully considering each statement. He emphasized that his relationship with Chor simply began from music, while not forgetting to repeatedly mention that he himself was married, as if wanting to clarify the boundaries and nature of the relationship. In this first interrogation phase, his tactics seemed very clear, trying to direct police attention to the note and the mysterious man named Lee, while continuously downplaying and simplifying his relationship with the victim, from possibly being lovers down to just teacher-student, then to ordinary friends. The ultimate goal was to create a safe distance between himself and the case, making police believe he was just a normal acquaintance with no reason for suspicion. Meanwhile, investigators, while still carefully recording testimony, weren't at all passive. They continuously cross-referenced the information Yim Wei-sheng provided with objective evidence, others' testimony, and small details in the case to check for any consistency or contradictions. And indeed, right during the record-making process, experienced investigators quickly discovered something wrong. They compared the two notes, the one Chor left for her sister and the one Yim Wei-sheng presented. Both mentioned Mr. Lee and the trip to Penang. But when police investigated the entire circle of Chor friends, colleagues, and regular customers, they found no one named Lee who fit. Police also asked Wei-sheng, "Do you know anyone named Lee among her friends?" He shook his head, answering that he also didn't know such a person existed. After completing the initial record, investigators carefully reviewed the entire interrogation and caught two notable points of suspicion. First, throughout the entire process, Yim Wei-sheng didn't speak Chinese at all. When asked, he even affirmed that he couldn't read or write Chinese. But the contradictory thing was, the note he presented was written entirely in Chinese, and before that he had been able to accurately and in detail recount its content to police. If he truly didn't know Chinese, how could he read and understand it? Second, attentive investigators noticed that Wei-sheng's arms and hands had quite obvious wounds. When asked about the origin of these wounds, his answer was different each time, without a single consistent and convincing explanation. When these points of suspicion piled up, police increasingly felt clearly that Yim Wei-sheng's testimony didn't hold up, had too many unreasonable parts. They decided to move to a deeper, more detailed interrogation phase. Questions began to be asked rapidly and specifically. What exact day and time did you last meet her? Where did you two meet? Was anyone else present? Who can testify for your statement? Does the time you mentioned match the time on the note? After round of relentless questioning, with questions posed from many different angles, contradictions in Yim Wei-sheng's testimony began to show clearly. What he said before didn't match what he said after. The alibi evidence he presented also kept changing. Each time challenged, he would adjust the story, trying to patch holes, but the more he patched, the more gaps appeared. The psychological pressure from investigators kept increasing. The atmosphere in the interrogation room became suffocating. Finally, after many hours of tense confrontation, Yim Wei-sheng couldn't endure anymore. His final line of defense collapsed. He bowed his head, voice trembling, as he admitted he was the perpetrator of the case. This was an important breakthrough. But immediately, before police could react, Yim Wei-sheng hastily added another sentence. But this wasn't premeditated. This was an accident, an unfortunate accident. We just argued. Emotions got out of control. Everything happened too fast. I had no intention, never wanted to be so cruel to her. Clearly, his tactic now was to admit what happened, but simultaneously try to reduce his criminal liability from premeditated murder, a charge that could lead to the death penalty, down to involuntary manslaughter or accidental death. However, veteran investigators didn't stop there or accept this simple explanation. They meticulously cross-referenced what Yim Wei-sheng recounted with details at the scene, with the forensic report, with the timeline of the case. And the more they cross-referenced, the clearer the contradictions became. So what happened between them that made him act so cruelly? According to Yim Wei-sheng's testimony, the relationship between him and Chor was actually just a brief, non-serious affair. He admitted that he had been attracted by her dependence, gentleness, and devotion to him. As a man, he liked the feeling of her caring for him, attending to him, admiring him. But he also affirmed that from the beginning, he never intended to go to marriage or build a long-term future with her. For him, this was just a temporary relationship, a non-binding pleasure. When asked to describe Chor, Yim Wei-sheng's tone became somewhat annoyed, even contemptuous. In his eyes, Chor was a woman who wanted this and also that. He recounted how she constantly pursued him, demanding more and more, demanding official status, demanding to publicize the relationship, demanding a wedding, demanding commitment about a future together. These demands, according to him, increasingly became pressure beyond what he could provide. Yim Wei-sheng explained further about his family circumstances. His family were Christian believers, living by strict moral principles. His parents belonged to the traditional generation, very concerned about reputation and social standing. For them, their son marrying a girl with a past as a dancer, singer in a karaoke bar was absolutely unacceptable. Therefore, to put an end to this relationship, to make Chor understand there was no more hope and let him go, Yim Wei-sheng decided to take a decisive action. He returned to Seremban and registered marriage with another woman. The reason he gave was that he did this only wanting Chor to let go, to end their relationship. But what Yim Wei-sheng completely didn't anticipate was Chor reaction. Instead of silently accepting and withdrawing as he expected, she decided to find him, furiously accusing him of deceiving her feelings all this time, of promising things he never intended to fulfill, of ruining her entire life. She demanded he immediately divorce his newly married wife, publicly take responsibility, and live with her as promised. According to Wei-sheng's testimony, on the afternoon of July 6th, Chor suddenly appeared at his house. She called ahead in a rushed voice, saying there was something very important that needed to be said immediately. When they met, she was in an extremely agitated, uncontrolled emotional state. She cried and screamed, her voice trembling with frustration. Specifically, she also threatened to find his newly married wife, to publicly expose their entire secret relationship so everyone would know what kind of person he was. He continued recounting that after a violent commotion, Chor suddenly fell silent and went into the bathroom to shower. But when she came out, she wasn't wearing clothes, and with a sudden action, she attempted to force him to have sex right there on the sofa in the living room. After everything ended, the two sat down trying to talk more calmly. But the conversation went nowhere. They still couldn't find common ground. Yim Wei-sheng resolutely refused to divorce, refused to take responsibility. Chor became more desperate, more angry. Finally, the argument erupted again, this time more violently. She cursed him as a betrayer, a despicable deceiver. She declared with a determined voice that if he wouldn't take responsibility, she would ruin his life, wouldn't let him have peace. Having said that, Chor stood up and walked straight toward the kitchen. He explained that at that moment he felt very worried, not knowing what she intended to do. Then he saw her turn back from the kitchen, hand holding a small fruit knife. Her emotions at this point were completely out of control. She screamed and rushed toward him with the knife in hand. "I was truly extremely frightened," he testified with a trembling voice. "She was rushing at me with a knife. I instinctively raised my hands to defend myself. In that chaotic struggle, my left hand was cut by the knife, blood flowing profusely. The feeling of pain and panic made me react instinctively. I tried to snatch the knife from her hand, but during the struggle, pulling and pushing, the knife suddenly stabbed into her chest. Everything happened too fast. I couldn't react." Yim Wei-sheng repeated many times with an earnest tone, emphasizing that this was just an unfortunate accident and he had no intention of killing her. Investigators continued to cross-reference the timeline, wound characteristics, and scene details point by point. In their eyes, there must be secrets behind this. The forensic report clearly recorded that the fatal wound in Chor Tho's chest was extremely deep, straight to the heart, difficult to explain as an accidental stab in panic. Additionally, there were many knife wounds on her body, the cuts consistently neat, showing the assailant after the incident had proceeded to coldly and expertly dismember the body. If it truly was an accidental impulse, why afterward could he still remain calm enough to divide the body into 11 pieces, wash them clean multiple times, package each one, choose hidden corners of wealthy neighborhoods to dispose of them dispersedly? These steps required sufficient time, physical strength, and psychological preparation, more like planned handling and evidence destruction. Based on these objective signs, police judged this was definitely not an accident, but a carefully planned silencing operation. On December 13, 1993, Yim Wei-sheng was officially brought to trial before the court. The charges against him were extremely serious. On July 6th of the same year, at an apartment near Merdeka Square, Wei-sheng murdered Chor Tho. According to Article 302 of the Malaysian Penal Code, if convicted of murder, the only sentence is the death penalty. The first trial lasted continuously for 3 days, from December 13th to 15th, with a tense atmosphere permeating the entire courtroom. There, the police officer in charge of interrogation was summoned to testify, presenting details of the entire investigation process, from taking testimony, making records, to the moment of arresting the suspect. However, after 3 days of litigation, the trial had to be temporarily adjourned and was scheduled to resume on February 28, 1994. During the waiting period, Wei-sheng was not allowed bail and was required to remain in detention awaiting the retrial date. However, when the trial reopened on February 28th, the situation suddenly changed completely. The prosecution announced that the court had decided to change the charge from murder to manslaughter. This meant the case was transferred to a lower court to continue trial, and the maximum sentence Wei-sheng faced was reduced from the death penalty to 20 years imprisonment. Before the court pronounced the sentence, the defense attorney submitted a lengthy testimony, carrying content like a final plea. In it, he affirmed that the incident was just an unintentional accident. The two people lost control during an argument. There was pushing and struggling, leading to Chor Tho's death. According to the defense's reasoning, there was no element of premeditation or intent to kill, but only impulsive action in a moment of anger. However, the prosecution firmly refuted this. They posed the question: if it truly was just an accident, why after the incident occurred did Wei-sheng divide the victim's body into 11 parts, wash each piece clean, package them in plastic bags, then scatter them everywhere? Not stopping there, he also burned all of Chor Tho's identity documents and flushed them down the toilet. Actions clearly showing systematic intent to conceal the crime, not ordinary panic reactions. However, the crucial point that made the case reach a dead end lay in the evidence. What the court had in hand was only the defendant's testimony, some indirect evidence, and the forensic examination report. The crime scene had been cleaned thoroughly. Almost no usable traces remained. There were no eyewitnesses who could describe the entire process of what happened, and the only person who knew the truth, Chor Tho, was now forever silent in those cold black plastic bags. Although the prosecution continuously emphasized the cruelty and calculation in the body disposal method to prove the element of intentional murder absolutely, they still lacked direct evidence. In other words, his attempt to destroy the body could prove intent to conceal the crime, but couldn't definitively confirm that from the beginning he intended to take Chor Tho's life. and therefore, under the principle of presumption of innocence, or benefit of the doubt to the accused, the court ultimately chose to believe the testimony about a case of manslaughter. Wei Sheng was convicted under Article 304, manslaughter, instead of Article 302, murder. After the case was transferred to the lower court, the final trial reached an official conclusion. Wei Sheng was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment on the charge of manslaughter. However, immediately after hearing the verdict, he clearly showed dissatisfaction, believing the sentence was too heavy relative to the nature of the incident, and immediately filed an appeal to the High Court, hoping for a reduced sentence. Nearly a year later, on December 3, 1994, the Malaysian High Court officially issued the final verdict. As a result, the prison sentence was reduced from 15 years to 12 years. However, the new sentence added a special condition. Wei Sheng must compensate the victim's family 10,000 Malaysian ringgit, approximately $2,400 USD, as an act of remedying consequences and showing remorse. If he failed to fulfill the compensation obligation, he would have to serve an additional year in prison as a substitute. This verdict, though considered legally concluded, in the hearts of many people, especially Chor's family, still couldn't be called justice, because the price of 12 years imprisonment and 10,000 ringgit, even if reasonable under the light of law, was still too small before the pain of losing a human life. And that is today's case. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next videos.